Thank you for coming. This is the Health Technology, Health IT track panel. We're short one speaker, Nicole Walker, who I'm told is fine, but was in a small car accident last night. So for those of you who are hoping to see Nicole, I'm sorry about that. So I was hoping we could accomplish two things in the discussion, and obviously given how intimate the forum is, I'd like to have this be a discussion. There are sort of two threads. So let each of us talk a little bit about what we're excited about in the market, and maybe kind of pierce the veil of how venture capitalists think and how we make decisions, but also to be quite tactical. And to the extent any of you are raising capital or thinking of raising capital, if you want practical advice as to how to best do that from firms like ours, we can also spend some time on that. I find that to be of less interest, but this is for your benefit. So please redirect. Before we get started, though, why don't we just quickly do introductions? I think their bios and the materials. I'm the moderator, so I get to ask the questions. But just by way of introduction, I run a venture fund called Flare Capital Partners. We're a reasonably new fund. We raised about 2 years ago a $200 million dedicated healthcare tech fund. And I think some of the thinking in that was our industry is becoming, I believe, more specialized, and so firms are becoming more narrow and deep in how they think about their investment strategies, and we wanted to exploit that by raising what is one of the larger dedicated healthcare tech funds. So all we do are software and services, really around the business of healthcare, and I've been in the investment business for about 25 years.
I'm Steve Uses from OrbiMed Advisors. I lead our global investments on the venture side in healthcare IT and healthcare services. OrbiMed has about $15 billion of assets under active management today. Over half of that's on the public side. On the private side, our investment, sort of three buckets. We have a couple global funds in Asia and in Israel, and actually we look in the US at sourcing a lot of our deals out of international markets. In the US, we have two large funds. We have a debt fund for more mature private companies, and our venture fund's a $975 million fund. It's stage agnostic. It's primarily focused on life sciences, so if you're here with biotech, that's all the rest of my partners or devices. I lead our investments in healthcare IT. We're just putting a toe in the water, but given OrbiMed's size, our toes are fairly large. So over the last 4 years, we've invested about $300 million in about 13 deals in healthcare IT. We generally get involved. We don't do companies that are pre-revenue or in pilots. When companies have a couple of enterprise stage deployments, we can really help them. We have about 20 health systems as limited partners, a couple of large pharma and a couple of large medical device companies, and really help companies evolve on their speed to scale.
And, good morning, I'm Ilona Baum. I'm the managing director for DEFTA Partners. DEFTA is about 2.5 decades old, but our fund is in healthcare is new. So it was founded a while ago by George Hara, who is now economic advisor to Prime Minister Abe in Japan, and we call ourselves the gateway to Japan. Our LPs are Japanese, and we're very early stage. We're a tiny little fish in this pond here. We'll raise about $50 million for investment. We've got 30 right now. We just launched this new healthcare fund. But the point about the fund is more strategic because of our LPs being Japanese corporations. To get a sense of it is when George Hara was advising Prime Minister Abe in the economics of Japan and that super aging population, he thought, gee, my goodness, he was an IT guy, made all his money in IT, and all of a sudden became a philanthropist and this economic advisor and said, boy, if we don't do anything about the rising healthcare costs, all of the developed nations are going to be hurting very badly. So his interest is in finding game changers. And so that's what we invest in. And obviously we have to be less risk adverse. We go in early, and hopefully we'll be having co-investors on the other end with all my partners here.
Great. Good morning, Matthew Vesta with Gilda Healthcare Partners. We're a transatlantic fund. We have offices both in Boston and in the Netherlands. We are on our fourth healthcare fund, about $280 million. It's our biggest fund. And we are healthcare specific. We look across med tech, digital health, and diagnostics in the US. And then in Europe, we add biotech and pharma. And I think the thing that makes us unique is we have some very strong partnerships with A lot of strategics, we have J&J and Phillips, who are LPs in our latest fund. No special rights, but what we do is share a lot of our deal flow with them, which has been really, really helpful. And I think having said that, it's important to recognize too, as Elena said, that we are middle to late stage. So for devices, we typically look at around FDA clearance, plus or minus if it's a technology or a mechanism of action that we understand pretty well. We will consider going earlier. For digital health, I think really the stage is one that we're actively figuring out. I have a lot of personal experience in building healthcare IT companies, and I think really recognizing the value proposition and the inflection points is important, and it's different depending upon the company. So with our current fund, we invest typically 12 to 15 million in the first round, saving some dry powder for follow-on investments, and typically look to put about 25 million to work per company. So we'll only do about 3 to 4 out of our US allocation.
And Matthew, just to pause on the healthcare IT portion of the strategy, you want to just give a sense of what's particularly interesting today?
Yeah.
Areas of real focus?
Absolutely. So I think we look at 4 particular categories, and we've sort of created our bundling around a lot of the themes that you'll see in the market. So we look at procedure outcomes optimization. So thinking about that, we look at all kinds of technologies that enable procedures to happen more efficiently, more effectively. These can be surgical procedures, interventional procedures, and we look at the care continuum, so helping patients be better prepared for procedures so procedures go smoothly, and then also assuring that patients are properly equipped to do what they need to do post-procedure to keep readmissions under control and also to optimize outcomes associated with that. The other area is population health, but more with a disease focus. Obviously, the population health started out with a lot of global cross-disease focus, and we think that there's a lot more opportunity when you understand the chronic disease. More specifically, behavioral health is an area that's interesting for us. I think recognizing the role of behavioral health in a lot of other chronic conditions and comorbidities as a driver for things like ED admissions. And then optimizing care delivery, so really looking at alternate sites of care, technology that enables care to be delivered outside the hospital, focusing on ambulatory and office-based labs and associated technologies.
Steve, would you see the priority similar, different?
A little different. When we go talk to our limited partners that run big health systems or big pharmaceutical companies, they're actually overwhelmed with the innovation that everybody in this room is bringing to them, and they can't manage it. As one of them put it very eloquently, she said, if you had to spend a week building your app for your iPhone, how many apps do you think you'd have on your phone? And that's what they're stuck with. They have to integrate with each supplier, with each disease area, and it's just too exhausting and too expensive for them. So as a result, we're looking at things that are more platform that we think will enable a lot of more micro innovations under NEO. But we see a big need to unleash innovation in healthcare is a lack of platforms to pre-manage the integration of applications and data that where it's already 90-95% pre-done. Too much money in startups goes into those type of efforts, and it really bogs down how fast a lot of startups can move. And then given the amount of money we tend to put to work in companies, we're looking a lot at automating workflow as well. Our view, honestly, is population health has become highly commoditized. Most CEOs today, fortunately, we got out of paper records. We now have everything digitized in healthcare. Any big enterprises really pulled that up into some analytical framework using data lakes, data engines, data warehouses, whatever you want to use. And so CEOs can predict what's going to happen. They know who's sick, where they're leaking, what the problems are. They have no tools to automate that on the front end to make that start to happen when a physician's meeting with a patient or a caregiver, actually how to actualize the change that they need to bring. So we're looking at a lot of scaled automated workflow tools that work a lot like supply chain management and other things that can track a patient as they go from place to place in the world. And so, so those are a few of the areas and a few of the macro problems we're looking to address in our healthcare IT portfolio.
And Ilona, you alluded to the fact that maybe you take on more risk given the stage you're playing. As it relates to this category, where are you spending time?
So I'm a lawyer by training, so I hate to say it, but you know what, when you see it, it's the old case on, you know what I'm talking about. And so we do have 2 investments, maybe 3, depending on how you count. And it wasn't like I went out and I said, I want this, that, or the other thing. I knew I wanted a point of care. And you might not think that that's digital health, but it is because they're using algorithms. It's all, you know. So to me, I check that box. I also was very interested in gathering data and creating this continuous care model so that you could end up assisting better health outcomes after you left the hospital, and there's definitely models for that. So we invested in a company called Lifeguard, which has now been picked up by Jefferson Hospital, and they're sort of running from hospital system to hospital system, so getting some great validation. And then sensors, we love sensors. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that a lot of our expertise comes from that area, the IT part. So we invested in a company that's putting sensors on catheters and whatnot and doing patches. But again, at some point they're creating a platform that will be able to be used, and it's all about the data and the platform that they've developed that they'll be able to maybe white label if they decide to do
And it
that.
sounds like, given the stage of those three examples, are pre-revenue
Oh, all
quite
of them.
early. So how do you think, again, in the spirit of trying to provide some advice and insight to how you make a decision, milestones, the size of the round, how do you size to something that is so nascent? How do you think about that as an investor?
We look for good deals, and we look for people that we just, a lot of it is intuition, and maybe having, being a lawyer and done trial work too, you kind of know who's going to drive it home and who's not, and it's not always somebody that's got the credentials. In fact, I don't want to name names, but there's somebody who's got a lot of credentials who's not driving it home in our portfolio, and I thought, boy, but look at this. I actually met, believe it or not, one of our investments, a guy on a plane, and he's just an MD, and he's driving it home. So it's not about the credentials, it's about sort of the ability to
So
sell.
it's the strength of the entrepreneur.
Yes, but, and it's got to be,
And what sort of market validation data do you look for?
I always have to have
Voice of
something.
the customer. Just give a sense of how you gather that.
Yeah, so a lot of people do pilots, but the pilots is just ongoing. I mean, there's companies that just, they never get beyond the pilot. So I want to say, well, where's your contract? And when is it going to get to that? But then also, I look to see who they're talking to in terms of the strategics. And to be frank, our LPs are strategics, so we go and ask them what they think.
Matthew, you think of milestones differently? You're more life cycle, so
Yeah.
reserves become important. How you think about kind of the life cycle of investment?
Yeah, so, and I think you touched on some interesting points, Elena. Ilona, thank you. There is a propensity to have too many pilots, and if pilots aren't leading to contracts, that sort of makes you sort of wonder what is going on, right? If you're running a pilot and you're establishing really good data, that data should be able to lead toward further indication, further traction. I think what we like to see is a really strong understanding of the problem that's being solved. So oftentimes we see too many companies that come along where it's a technology for blank, or it's this for that. No, what's the problem you're solving? Help us unpack where your solution is going to fit in. And I think as digital thinks about disrupting current workflows, that's great. But what we know in healthcare is that workflows don't change as fast as the technology does. So really recognizing how you're going to fit into that workflow, and I think having a really good idea of what tactics or strategies you're going to employ to change that workflow is really important.
And so given the crushing sales cycles that we're all familiar with, how do you think about sizing the round, say a typical A round for a healthcare tech company? How do you think about milestones? What are you trying to accomplish in that A round?
Yeah, so and I'm going to deflect a little bit because we haven't done rounds that early in health IT. I think we're taking a cautious approach and really trying to digest where we place our bets there. In terms of the amount that we'll put in play, we are sensitive to valuation, and we find that when we're sitting across the table from non-healthcare focused investors, valuations can be buoyed sometimes artificially because of the the kingdom that may be coming with
The
this.
euphoria.
Right,
Steve, how do you
exactly.
think about milestones as you structure these?
Well, at any round,
And you're a master at structuring.
Yeah, so our firm's a bunch of scientists, so what we like to see is enough data to decide whether we made a good investment or not and should continue with it. And so it's different for each company with each stage in terms of what they need to accomplish. But from a starting point, even though we're stage agnostic, We only cheat if we do an A round. The company has to have strategic partners that are committed to scale. Because if you don't have scaled customers in the market with the full breadth of your product over a couple of enterprise deployment, no other enterprise can take the risk of deploying you at that scale. So it's usually a matter of getting to a milestone that really is a value creation event in either terms of step function and scale, changing the economics of the business because of the scale that you've reached. It just can't be pure linear growth of a math formula, and then we need another 10 or 20 billion dollars. And we have our whole public side, which leads to a big discipline, because when you come to me with your business plans, I literally sit down with my public analyst that covers healthcare IT stocks and says, I know this never happens, but assume this plan goes exactly to plan over 3 to 5 years and these numbers get reached with this story. What do you value it at when we come and give you the IPO pitch? And then we work back on discounts for there. And it's very sobering. There's only been 15 healthcare IT IPOs, I think, in the last 4 years, only 16 acquisitions of venture-backed healthcare IT companies at over $100 million. So as you're in the room and you're thinking about your company, think about how much capital you really need. There's a lot of tuck-in acquisitions at small values. I started 6 companies. As an entrepreneur, I made the most company on something that never made the newspapers, but we built the whole company on $1 million. You don't need to sell it for very much then. You raise a couple $100 million, you make all kinds of press for selling it for a couple $100 million, but nobody makes any money. So in terms of this, you really have to think through about what value is being created, et cetera. And for us, sorry if I'm taking too much airtime, if we really love a company, we try not to let valuation get in the way. So you have 2 choices. If you want a certain value, then we can create structure around things like a 2x participating preference, where we get the first 2x, which is good for us, and then anything else is upside, or we prefer to invest honestly where we think true values are, but those are usually less than most entrepreneurs are willing to accept in today's market. So
And if I may just make a point, I think you touched on something important, Steve, is that it is seductive to have these high valuations in ed tech. I think we see it more than other places. And one of the things that we like to do is really have a pragmatic conversation about where you are today, where you're going, and to not let valuation get away with you.
yeah.
So the last, I think if you include this year annualized, the last 4 years, we've seen about $4 billion of venture capital come into this sector from a less than $1 billion annual rate, plus or minus 300 new companies are created every year. How do we feel like that's sustainable, or is it? Steve has anxiety. Does the rest of the panel share Steve's anxiety about where we are? And Matthew alluded to non-healthcare investors coming into the sector. So how do you think about the environment right now, the funding environment?
Yeah, so I think we've talked about this quite a bit, and there is a belief that it's not sustainable. You're not seeing the returns, and a lot of the companies that Steve talked about that have exited are 5 to 8 year old companies, if not older. I think it's really, really attractive to have smart, innovative people coming in with ideas that are outside of the industry and trying to crack the norms a little bit. But I think it's really important that we're not looking at areas where there's 20, 30 competitors all trying to do the same thing. Differentiation is important. And with health IT, it's easier to, I think, do something that's very similar to somebody else without really having a very clear point of differentiation and
And
valuation.
so, again, advice to the audience, thinking around the syndicate construction. Should it only be healthcare investors? Should they look outside our category for investors? Role of strategic investors? How are any of you thinking about around the syndicate construction? Who's going to have the endurance to stay through a cycle if we're going to go through maybe a little bit of a dip here?
Well, part of the problem is we have 140 digital health incubators alone in the United States that will give you a couple 100,000. A plus and a minus is 40 health systems in the U.S. today now have venture arms. And we like them in the sense that if you're small, you need a couple $1 million, you're getting a twofer. You're getting a customer that's committing to scale you in the enterprise, plus the money that you need to get there. And so we like to see those as early stage investors where we follow on to. They make a lot of sense, but honestly, there's too many of them. They each want their own X, and when there's 20 X's in the market, none of them can grow big enough to generate the returns. So I have a nice list on my desk of about 30 companies where I love the market, I love the team, I love the company, and their stock price, frankly, is 4 times too high. So the market crashes and they come back and their stock's available at 20, 30 cents. We're happy to invest because we think the markets are real. We see markets growing at 20, 30, 40% a year. We just see too low barriers to entry. Because in healthcare IT, rarely do you have something where you've invented the technology, you're adapting it, and other people can adapt it too. And I'm sorry, an algorithm is not IP. It is IP, but anybody can figure out the math to get to the same place anyway. And so, to the point earlier, it's really hard to find differentiated assets. So we put a lot of emphasis on getting strategic partners as co-investors that can really generate speed to scale,
Yeah.
so that you're the bigger player in the space, and you can actually, we think there's real good private equity plays of scooping up a lot of the failed players to build, and we'll see a lot of consolidation, a lot of these subsegments in these markets, because they are real markets. I mean, the problems are real, the companies are real, there's just too many of them, and
Yeah.
values are too high today.
So I'm thinking that I'm definitely not a pure health IT investor, because unlike a lot of people in this field, I actually like to see something other than an algorithm. I want it. And in fact, I just was at an angel investing forum the other day, and I was telling somebody about our portfolio, and they said, oh, we won't do anything that has a device or anything that needs any sort of approval. And I was like, well, I won't do anything that doesn't have some barrier to entry. Because to what you said, I like to have some point of differentiation. So maybe we're not a pure play.
And maybe to pick up on that, services is sort of a necessary evil in healthcare tech. There's, the software companies have a heavy services component, and then there's the whole service, tech-enabled service models. How are you thinking about services, accepting or acknowledging the gross margins of services or a fraction of what software serves? How does that play into your thinking, whether things are attractive, opportunities are attractive? How do you internalize services as a necessary evil?
Well, I don't know if people really care what I think of, unless you're really just looking for $1 million, but I don't like a service-only business. I come from Genentech, so I really actually come from the biopharma, area where there's huge multiples. And when, I meet with somebody and they tell me that they're going to make a few $100,000 a year, even, I hate to say it, just a couple million, and they might get to 5 million in 4 years. All of a sudden, I just feel like the air is just gone out of the balloon. I was like, I don't know if we really need to talk anymore.
Steve,
I like services, actually. Because the problem that you have in healthcare is if you just sell licenses, you have too many customers that just can't accept technology. They actually don't have the business processes and change management in place to make it work. So we really push our companies to be on an indifference curve. For the 20 or 30 health systems, the Geisingers, the UPMCs of the world that are very, very sophisticated, you can sell them technology. They have an infrastructure to make it work. For the rest of the world, if you don't hold their hand and make it work, they're gonna fail with your technology and come back and point a finger at you. And by the way, a couple of fairly successful healthcare IT companies like Epic and Health Catalyst built their whole business on services. And so we're positive on services. They just need to be priced appropriately. It's not the same price as doing an implementation where you're banging it in on a commoditized basis. You're adding real value to these organizations about how they need to change, how they need to integrate and adapt the technology. So I like companies that can be an outsourced player with the service bureau, be a solution with services, or just be technology. It's all the same technology
And
underneath.
so the nuances as the entrepreneur presents to you, how they talk about services, and they just maybe give some color. What resonates for you?
What resonates is the degree of how much of the market they might be able to capture. So for example, we have a lot of people coming in saying value-based health is a problem. We absolutely agree. The world's moving there. We don't know what speed. But if they just have a technology to hand to people to measure risk or manage risk, there's literally only 30 customers they can sell to today. The rest of them can't adapt that technology. So how are they going to accelerate how the rest of the market can use their technology? And it's a problem Epic faced 2 decades ago in how people could use an EMR. The problem Health Catalyst faced a decade ago in terms of how people could use data warehouses when their data was so disorganized. They had to help them organize the data so they could begin to extract it. So when you think about the problem you're solving, think about, is it just purely a lack of technology that exists today, or is it a lack of know-how that needs to be managed as well? And if it is, then you need to find a way to capitalize on that as well. And you should be gaining a lot of expertise. You're going to multiple companies, you're learning best practices, and your ability to get paid for that, to us, is a really essential part of building a differentiated and high-growth healthcare IT companies in most spaces.
Maybe slightly lower margin.
I think you can price it pretty highly. You know what I'm saying? And if you look at how Epic prices their knowledge, or these companies, they're pricing it at 60-70% gross margin levels. So when we're on boards, we don't like to give it away. If somebody doesn't really value it, then we won't provide it. So
Matthew, do you guys think of services differently?
Yeah, so I think Steve touched on a lot of the important factors. Services can be a sinking part of your business. You don't want to look at services doing anything and everything for the customer. You need to understand what value you're delivering, draw the boundaries around that for the services that you're delivering, and figure out a way to scale them. I think the margins, as Steve articulated, can be appropriately created, again, as long as you're not doing too much. So when I was with Optum prior to joining Gilda, we were actually building a services-intensive model, and it was a patient engagement platform, so it had technology, but it also had services, and we found that the services are an important part of delivering the value. You got faster outcomes, faster returns by incorporating services. It can be a slippery slope. So it really is about understanding where you're creating value, and if the customer wants more, then they have to pay for more.
I'm going to switch topics maybe a little abruptly. Trump Care, the current environment, has it caused either any of you to kind of recalibrate your strategy, your enthusiasm? Have you seen softness in budgets in your portfolio? Just kind of give some sense of how you're thinking about the current regulatory, political environment. Alon.
I always, I'm always first to come out with, first of all, I'm proud to say I'm a Democrat. I just have to say it.
You're in Boston, so you're probably not
Yeah, it's
wrong.
good. I mean, good. Well, I grew up in Jersey, so I have an accent too at some point. But I actually think it's good business. It's a good time. I mean, I like Gottlieb. I think he's great. I think he's going to do great things. Policy-wise, to get approvals a lot more streamlined, and I think we're going to be in a better situation. So overall, it doesn't bother me too much.
So given we're investing in things that should be relevant 3 to 5 years, have you accelerated your pace of investing in this uncertain time?
It hasn't affected me at all. I'm not weary about it, and
Should entrepreneurs be reflecting that in their pitch to you?
No.
An awareness of the current.
to me, I don't think so.
I think our view is the press covers the healthcare policy debate very, very poorly. And most Americans weren't affected by Obamacare. Most won't be affected by the repeal. We segment it. So obviously, if you have a Medicaid-based business and you're relying on Medicaid, there are tremendous forces in flux, and nobody knows where that's going to settle out. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, if you have a business that lowers costs, improves outcomes, and leverages technology to do that, whatever solution, whether you're more free market, more government, we're going to be moving in that direction. And so we tend to take a pretty apolitical view of policy. We don't invest in investments that are dependent on policy to be successful, and we do think the macro forces are going to continue outside of politics. It's being driven by employers, other people that are going to be pushing this, and we think government actually may follow rather than lead. But there are some segments that I do think you have to be careful of. And then if you're in an area that's heavily influenced by reimbursement, we view as an investor that we can't control the umbrella. We think we need to do a play that wins either way. So if reimbursement stays very high, we all make a lot of profits. If reimbursement gets compressed, then we need to make sure that we have a cost structure that allows us, as other people go out of business, to pick up that volume and be successful. So since we're only a healthcare investor, we continue to invest regardless of political
Given
climate.
the breadth,
We do pay attention to it.
you have a lot of names in the various portfolios. Did you see any, or do you expect to see any softness in the IT budgets this year? What are your?
We haven't, just
analysts say?
because our analysts, there was, right with the election, there was a lot of shock and a lot of people pulled back. People view value-based care as coming. It's changing the business model for providers, where before you just had to provide services, bill and collect. Now you got to measure outcomes. You're going to be on the hook for quality, whether you're a pharma company, device company, provider. So people, after taking a breath after a few months, we see budgets being fairly robust, and we don't see much change from, it kind of froze from a few months before the election to a few months after, but the rest of it's on a pretty steady stream.
Matthew, you seeing the same? Have you reoriented in any way your strategy, your pace?
No, I think our theme is better care at lower cost. I think that is not changing. As Steve said, value-based care is coming. But I think it's not enough to say value-based care. It really is important to, again, unpack that and understand, is it a risk-based contract for a population? Is it a bundled payment for a procedure? We talk about readmission penalties. Are we talking about, still fee-for-service type of models? It's really important to understand the segments of the market that you're going into, and to really have a good feel for how those segments will evolve. I mean, the policy will take a while to unfold and then work its way down into the stream of care.
I'm happy to entertain questions. I was going to ask another one if somebody has a burning issue or comment. Yes.
You mentioned earlier about embedding services as part of technology. I wanted to understand what part of services are we talking about? Professional services to implement and operationalize, or providing services as part of the workflow and business process and coaches and together which part of services?
You want to clarify?
Sure. So if you let's take a prime example you brought up, like care management on discharge. If you're Montefiore Hospital, part of the discharge program, you have 500 care managers sitting there that are ready to take that burden on, that have been trained. They happen to have to do a lot of their work manually today. So if you give them technology tools, they'll be much more productive and effective. If you go to another hospital, I don't want to take names, but that doesn't have much of an outpatient footprint, hasn't invested in care management, they're still financially responsible for discharge and readmissions. They have no capacity to execute that. So in that case, you might have to bring care managers to them to be able to stand up the solution that you're bringing to track patients downstream. So that's where we like to have that capability, whether it's partnered, whether it's internally part. Otherwise, you can't sell to that second hospital. They can't take your technology today. So that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about the implementation services and the integration. You have to find a way to do that, hopefully, minimally, light footprint, fast, better, cheaper. But the real value out of adding new capability or enhanced capability for organizations that don't have it, you might be providing bodies, you might have a more of a consultative approach where you're helping to train them be successful.
And the
in that
nuance
area.
for me, Stephen, what I think I hear you saying is as the entrepreneur, don't hide from that.
Right.
But make sure you get paid,
Fully.
ideally even a premium to what otherwise could be found in the market.
Exactly. Yeah, and you can't use that as your discount mechanism to sell your technology. It has to stand on its own.
Other questions? Yes, way in the back.
Firstly, thanks for your insights. What do you think about consumer-facing healthcare IT and consumer health and wellness? Sort of where things are headed with
So the question was, I think if we could hear it, we probably heard it, but it's around consumer-facing technologies, that category, health and wellness. Where is that on the cycle, the hype cycle curve?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it presents an interesting opportunity and also a unique set of challenges. If a technology, again, is truly differentiated in a category of patients that really care, using, expecting mothers, for example, there's certain behaviors that they'll exhibit, doing research, trusting reviews, trusting, advisors, their doctors, et cetera, that can help them make decisions. When we look at products that have a consumer bent, we will typically look for some sort of trusted advisor who is a clinician who either starts the cycle or who checks in to kind of keep things going and keeping the patient engaged. It adds a gate of, this has been something that's approved or vetted for the patient, so at least they feel a little bit more confident undertaking this. But I think it also creates a barrier to entry and almost a control setting for that company to really separate. A doctor isn't going to be pushing 10 of the same kind of app if one is working better than another.
We break it into a few things because your question had a few areas. We look at some wellness companies that have been very successful, a Fitbit, a MindBody, a Peloton, as consumer companies. We don't view those as healthcare companies. They make no attempt, nor should they, to integrate to the health system. They create good benefits, but they're fundamentally, in our mind, consumer-oriented companies that are more like consumer products, and people that are really good at building brands will help those companies. We can't help them. In terms of consumers for core healthcare, we think we've done a real disservice in the Western world where we've given our consumers very short arms in terms of paying for anything. They look for the government to pay, the employer to pay, the insurer to pay, but not them. So people that will spend thousands of dollars on entertainment won't spend $100 out of their pocket on their own diabetes management. So we found that any type of play where the business model is dependent on the consumer to pay pivots. They need some aggregator, they end up being B2B2C. B2B2C, we think, is a really important model, and a lot of companies that are really good at selling other businesses do a very poor job at pushing it through the consumer. And you can look at public data of companies like Teladoc and Castlight, to name a few, that did an excellent job of selling enterprises and have really struggled with how to get the pull-through from consumers. So When you have one of those type of business models, we do look for consumer capability. It's an essential part of the success, even though the consumer, but we're relying on consumer payment. You got to show us. We would never invest in an early stage business. And then finally, point on this is different than the rest of the world. In Asia, we are investing in direct to consumer businesses because the business models there are that the consumer pays outside of Japan for their healthcare. So in China and India, we are doing healthcare IT investments in consumer-based models.
I would suggest and push back that most venture investors in this category, if the lead is around a wellness offering, tend to glaze over because there's so many out there.
Yeah.
But it's an N of one. We haven't talked about sort of breakthrough scientific advances that may be adjacent to our sector and how they may influence. So genomics, are you thinking at all about that set of discoveries, gene editing on our category, the clinical trial space? How are you thinking about kind of adjacent scientific breakthroughs as they may affect the healthcare tech space?
Well, I really like the space as it applies to clinical trials, and I think there's a huge opportunity there. And I think finally the big biotechs and pharma are starting to see this, and they're saying, gee, you know what? I think that this could help me enroll faster, and you know what? I can have decentralized clinical trials, and I can have, a longitudinal study. And I think that I think it might be maybe 18 months off, but if that's where I would be placing my bet.
We're seeing a ton of innovation around clinical trial space. Can you be more specific of where you think the seam is? Where's the market opportunity?
Well, I don't want to give away all my secrets, but I haven't found something that I want right now, but I know that
What's your best idea?
my best idea? What's one I've already invested in? So, no, I mean,
You can shamelessly promote it.
no, I don't want it. Well, I mean, it's a continuous care, but I think it has, so it's Lifeguard, and they're for cancer patients. But I think that, I keep saying, why don't you go talk to the pharma? Hey, I can get you a couple ins there, and I think that's going to help.
Matthew, you have similar perspective?
Yeah, so I actually have I think a vested interest in, formally vested in genomics, building a business in genome bioinformatics, and it's a very exciting area of science, and I think there's a tremendous amount of promise. Like everything else, it's really understanding the segment, the value proposition. So just to give an example, in oncology, there's obviously a lot of use of biomarkers for determining therapy. I had a meeting with some of the guys from one of the biggest payers in the US, and the question that they asked me is, will the information that the doctors are presented with change their course of care? And if you can't guarantee that, we're not going to pay for it. And really what that makes you realize is you have to understand the readiness of the consumer for the information. There's consumer genomics, there's clinical genomics, and then there's research. And we're seeing the greatest traction, I think, in research and helping enroll clinical trials faster, a little bit slower outside of the academic centers and actually treating the patients. And I'm afraid of the consumer genomics part.
Yeah, very similar segmentation in the sense that and for our portfolio, we view it as too early. The time's going to be too far. So when these entrepreneurs come in, they all have the same names. And when we double click on how many patients, they all have Stanford as one of their customers. They're working with one investigator in one lab with 20 patients. And so what we're talking to, nobody's emerged where they can be the real platform for genomics, even across research, let alone clinical. And same thing, we see about 90% of the business in the research realm. Very little of it in the clinical realm. Where it is in the clinical realm, it's very narrow. So if somebody has something really great for a specific type of cancer, we say, what's that mean to repurpose this somewhere else? And they have to start all over again. So they're really point applications that are very, very narrow. So we're looking at the breakout point is where people can start to reuse some of these things. We have a big investment portfolio in genomic diagnostics. So we're in Singulex, Nutera, Good Start, Invitae, there's some of the names. And the companies have done very, very well. We've kind of been disappointed in the investor results. They're just, the market, there's a lot of noise, but not a lot of actual revenue movement. And then for clinical trials, if you invest there, it either has to be a small amount of capital where you can get out for a small amount because it is a niche. There's only, phase 4 of Medidata. There's only been a couple of companies that have really broken through to create a lot of value by concentrating just in the clinical trial space. We like it as an early entree to a lot of clinical plays because there's a lot of money there, people will pay. but it's really hard to build a business solely in the clinical trial space that will scale. We think there'll be a lot of niche companies, and it's a very broken space, so a lot of room for innovation. Just, if I were being an entrepreneur and investor, I would want to see low capitalization where a modest exit would still be a good return for everybody.
Any other
Oh, well, that's our model.
We have about 10 minutes. Today, one last question. Today there was a somewhat provocative article in the Wall Street Journal about capital budgets for hospitals and how they're beginning to re-architect their delivery models on a more distributed basis. One of the great promises of our category is care at a distance, care at lower cost, care in non-traditional settings. How do you see that playing out? Describe what the hospital in 15 years looks like. What is a hospital? Are we going to have the system be really a la carte? Is the promise of these tools going to enable that kind of care model?
I mean, I think we're definitely getting there. Cellular communication, data integration, sensors, telemedicine. You're setting the stage at multiple different levels to enable more care to be done outside the hospital. And the hospital is an interesting model. There's a tremendous amount of overhead, a tremendous amount of liability, and you're even seeing this in office-based labs. The more you can move a procedure out of the hospital, the potential greater for adoption and uptake. And I think, just to get back to your point, Mike, about what does the hospital look like, I think we'll probably start to see a lot more automation and kind of self-check-in type of technologies. Not that you'll be automatically diagnosed. I think that's a little bit too far away, but really enabling as much as can be done outside of the four walls of the hospital to be done at home. Preventing readmissions, keeping patients in check, checking in on patients more frequently to prevent a lot of the overuse in the system.
Yeah, we spend a lot of time looking outside the U.S. at models that are going to come back in, and it's really fascinating when you go to the third world today, because our people complain about how little they can do with so much. And you're seeing, I was just in Bangladesh with the Minister of Health. We have one of our portfolio companies with a lot of operations there. And they've really wired their villages where they're doing a lot of education. They're doing now clinical management in their villages where they can take care of 60 to 70% of the people via telemedicine with the equivalent of a emergency medical tech trained person. They're not a doctor, not a nurse.
Yeah.
Now 30, 40, 50% needs a nurse or a doctor, and they got to walk 3 hours, but Bangladesh can't afford to build clinics and hospitals in each of these locations. And that's going to bleed over to our underserved population, eventually to our overserved. The second thing that doesn't get enough attention, though, in asking the question is behavioral norms in the United States and social norms. We have 3 to 4x the number of people dying in our hospitals than in Japan or in Europe. And so that's where they make a lot of their money. People stay there until they expire, and they're not going to be able to help them or save them. And so I think part of it is the technical curve will keep following. What can be moved out will be moved out. But part of it is the demand side of the equation. How much insistence will there be for that type of kind of global critical care that can only be given in a hospital when the results and outcomes aren't that much? And that part of the equation, I think, is more in hospice companies and behavioral companies, and that will have an equal or larger impact in our view.
Yeah, so I think that you're going to see a lot more self-diagnosis, which is great, and I think you're going to see more portability of your patient records, which again is much needed. And I was talking to a physician a couple of weeks ago, and she says, "You remember when everyone used to have their own records and they carried them around with them?" I'm like, no. But I do have some of my own X-rays and it would be nice, to own your own records again. And she has a really interesting approach to that. But I think that you'll see finally, at least in the U.S., an emergence where the patient is taking a lot more responsibility for their own care, and it is a mindset change, and it's got to happen. And with that, we will end up hopefully decreasing the cost of care, because that's absolutely fundamental in the coming century. Because we have to look that far in advance. We got to do something different here. So, and these point-of-care devices are going to be really helpful in that regard. And early diagnosis is going to be really important, and with that, better outcomes.
Question?
So, I'm with a hospital innovation group, and sometimes, I think a lot of times, external companies have a pathway to try to bring digital innovation into the hospital and also move it out, so our doctors have ideas, right? One of the challenges, I think, sometimes is how do we collaborate and work with VCs and venture, because we're asked often, startups are pitching us too, to take on some risk in that innovation journey, which we need, all the things you're saying, we need to change our care and delivery. How can we kind of all work together so that, we're not an investment firm, but we're being asked very early on, and we're willing to participate early on and collaborate and co-develop and do these things. And we're trying to figure out how that happen in the hospital. How can we work with you better to make sure things aren't getting stalled because someone's asked us to take on all the risk of doing a pilot or something like that? So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I hope we didn't offend you earlier.
No, I think this is a really helpful bill. A lot of the things you said are things that we're.
Steve, how would
It's about how do we work together?
To work together,
Like,
I think honestly, a lot of hospitals have to learn to say no. So if you look at how technology works in the enterprise space, the movement to winners is much, much faster. And basically, we end up doing a lot of advice for our limited partners and for big health systems and big pharma companies on how they should manage technology. And we view it as a continuum. On one hand, you should have sandbox areas where very cheaply you can experiment with new technologies to learn how to interact with customers, how to change your workflows. But you shouldn't be investing very much in integrating those things back to your system and hardwiring it. And you should be getting on with the process of learning. And when technologies are very new, like we were talking about genomics, you might want to work with 2, 3, 4 vendors that are all very small and learn from that what you really want. Most hospitals can't really define what they want. And then as things emerge, too many hospitals want their own. And you quickly have to get to standards. In enterprise technology, there's rarely more than 2, 3, 4 winners in a space. Here you'll see 10, 15, 20 vendors doing population health, doing analytics on the same things. And so, and that consolidation actually helps the pace of innovation in those spaces. So I think too many hospitals are trying to innovate when they don't have the capability to really drive innovation and scale innovation in their organizations. The last part I would say on it, if you have a real problem and you're doing something to learn, if it's a sandbox, that's fine. If you don't have a real pathway to scale that across all your hospitals or across all your departments, I would really question the value of why you're spending so much energy there. So think backwards. What's the macro problem you're solving? How is this a point of proof of concept rather than a pilot where if this is successful, I can deploy it across my whole organization and get a lot of lift. Your vendor is going to be a lot happier, the VCs are going to be happier, and you as a hospital are going to be happier. And so we work with hospitals that have that mindset rather than a doctor in GI wants to do this and a doctor in cardiology wants to do that. They end up just with a hodgepodge. And given the lack of the platforms that I opened this with, it's impossible for your CIO then to manage all the innovation that's occurring at the bottom levels of your organization.
Yeah, and I think just one other thing to add to that is, as you're forming the concept or forming the company, make it portable. Too often the workflows or the technologies or the techniques are too localized. And if that compromises the procedure, you have to ask yourself, is it really something that can withstand the test of time? But really look outside the 4 walls, take a great idea and test it in the market the way any entrepreneur or startup would do.
And I'll just add one little thing. There's a great little institute down in Southern California called the Innovation Institute. I don't know if you've heard about them, but they're just a consortium of many, many hospitals that have decided that they had too many doctors or physicians going around trying to create their favorite little invention, and they didn't have an ecosystem. So the Institute created an ecosystem. They got some funding from philanthropists, and now they pick sort of maybe the top 50 projects, but they nurture them, like an incubator. And, I'm an early investor. They have a little money, and I'm going down there, and we'll be looking at some of the investments, so we'll maybe co-invest in a couple of them. But the point is to develop the ecosystem that can help those projects along.
One more question down the back.
Be curious who you all think is the best customer for digital health today and maybe in the future. Is it health systems, insurers, self-insured employers, consumer? Where do you think from an adoption and a revenue model, who are the best customers?
Matt, do you want to answer Jeff's question? They're partners.
Yeah, we are. So great question, Jeff. I'm going to punt real quick on this one to get some objective feedback. But the capital budgets for health IT and enterprise systems in hospitals is being squeezed. Really looking at creative business models to fund these things. The payer, is something that we know is playing an increasing role in getting these types of enterprise softwares funded and digital health funded. But I think also recognizing the fit within the care flow, if it's procedure specific, maybe MedTech, if it's population and provider or payer.
I violently disagree.
Good.
Any other thoughts to that?
Well, I'm going to
Jeff's
punt by
question?
just saying not the consumer.
I think the common thing, I don't think it's segment specific. We're kind of segment neutral. I think it's the concept of reuse. Think about how broadly the technology or what you're doing can be deployed. So, not to pick on anybody, but instead of doing behavioral health within pre-diabetes, if it's all about exercising more, eating better, changing your behavior, why doesn't that work across all chronic diseases? Or instead of just tackling depression blocks what happens in a lot of diseases in terms of recovery. I have a hip replacement, and I don't like the fact that I'm not active. So we tend to think about things around where do you get a broad amount of reuse where it's 80-90% reuse, and maybe you're tweaking it in different situations is maybe a way that I would think about that. That's not saying pharma or it's not segment dependent, but where you have a solution that can be used and reused on a broad basis.
Super. I think that's a wrap. I welcome you to join us at lunch. Thank you.